The OV Prime had been burning for 17 days. Ambassador stood in the underground bunker beneath what used to be the Grand Council Hall and watched the screens with hollow eyes. His pale blue skin was covered in ash and dried blood that was not his own. He had not slept in 4 days. He had stopped counting the dead after the first million. The Dominion Armada hung in orbit like a swarm of metal insects. 300 warships had arrived without warning and begun their assault before they could even understand what was happening. The orbital defense platforms had lasted 6 days. The planetary shields had held for another 8. Now there was nothing between the Dominion troops and the surface except the thin atmosphere and the prayers of a dying world. Had sent distress calls to every species in the Galactic Council. He had begged the Collective for their famous battle cruisers. He had pleaded with the Republic for their shield technology. He had even reached out to the Ancient Order who had not involved themselves in galactic affairs for over 1,000 years. Every response was the same: sympathy, regret, promises to raise the matter in the next council session, and nothing else. The Dominion knew this. They had watched the call for help and watched the galaxy do nothing. Overlord, the commander of the invasion fleet, had even broadcast a message mocking them for their faith in galactic unity. He called them fools for believing that anyone would risk their own ships and soldiers for a species that could offer nothing in return. Prepared one final transmission. He did not address it to any specific species or government. He simply broadcast it on every open channel, a plea to anyone who might be listening. He attached footage of the invasion, images of cities burning, videos of children being separated from their parents and loaded onto Dominion harvest ships. He did not ask for military intervention. He simply asked for someone to witness what was happening so the galaxy would remember. The message traveled outward at the speed of light and then faster through the relay network that connected the civilized systems. Most species received it and filed it away with the other tragic news of the day. Some watched the footage and felt genuine sorrow before returning to their own concerns. A few debated sending humanitarian aid after the invasion was complete. And then the message reached a small human patrol vessel called the USS Relentless. Admiral was 53 years old with gray hair. She no longer bothered to hide in lines around her eyes that told the story of 30 years in uniform. She commanded a frigate with a crew of 212 souls and orders to patrol the neutral zone between human space and the unclaimed territories. Her mission was to observe and report. She was not authorized to engage in combat under any circumstances without direct orders from Earth Command. She read the transmission in her private quarters with a cup of cold coffee growing colder on her desk. She watched the footage 3 times. She saw the child reaching for her mother as Dominion soldiers dragged them apart. She saw the old and the sick being sorted into groups marked for immediate termination. She saw a civilization being dismantled piece by an enemy that viewed them as nothing more than resources to be harvested. Had joined the Terran Navy because she believed in something. She had grown up on stories of the old Earth navies that sailed wooden ships across oceans to fight for freedom and dignity. She had read about soldiers who charged into hopeless battles because surrender was not an option. She had been taught that wearing the uniform meant standing for something greater than yourself. Her orders were clear. They were not allies. They had voted against humanity's admission to the Galactic Council not once but twice. Their ambassador had called humans galactic infants in open session and suggested that Earth be placed under the supervision of a more mature species. They had never offered humanity anything except contempt. Lieutenant Commander Jake knocked on her door and entered when she called. He was 30 years old with the kind of face that still believed the universe rewarded good intentions. He had graduated top of his class at the academy and requested assignment to a patrol vessel because he wanted to see the frontier. He had not yet learned that the frontier was mostly empty space and boring reports. He stood at attention and waited for her to speak. Turned her screen so he could see the frozen image of the child. Jake watched in silence. His jaw tightened and his hands curled into fists at his sides. When the footage ended, he took a slow breath and met his commander's eyes. Admiral asked him what regulations said about this situation. Jake recited the relevant codes from memory. Non-intervention in conflicts between non-allied species, strict neutrality in territorial disputes not involving human interests, mandatory withdrawal from combat zones without explicit authorization from Earth Command. He knew the rules because he had studied them carefully and believed they existed for good reasons. Asked him what he thought they should do. Jake was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the screen again, and at the child who would probably be dead before any council session could be convened. He thought about his sister back on Earth and her two daughters who were about the same age as that child. He thought about what he would want someone to do if the situation were reversed. He said that regulations existed to prevent reckless actions, but that there were moments when following regulations meant becoming the kind of person who watched children die and did nothing. Nodded slowly. She had been testing him and he had passed. She told him to get her a secure line to Earth Command on Priority 1 and to wake the entire crew. She wanted every station manned and every system ready by the time she finished her call. Jake asked if they were going to violate their orders. Stood and straightened her uniform. She told him that she was going to request new orders, and if those orders did not come in time, she was going to make a decision that she could live with for the rest of her life, however short that might be. She walked to the bridge with Jake following close behind. The crew snapped to attention as she entered, and she could see in their faces that they had already seen the transmission. Word traveled fast on a small ship. They were looking at her with a question in their eyes, and she realized that they were waiting to see what kind of leader she was. She sat in her command chair and opened the channel to Earth. She did not know if anyone would listen. She did not know if humanity had the strength or the will to do what needed to be done. But she knew that she had to try because trying was the only thing that separated people who made history from people who simply watched it happen to others. The transmission went out across the void toward a small blue planet that had only recently joined the galactic community. And in offices and command centers across that planet, people began to wake up and read the message that would change everything. The emergency session of the United Terran Defense Council began at 3 in the morning Earth Standard Time. Men and women in rumpled uniforms and hastily chosen suits filed into the secure chamber beneath the rebuilt city of New Washington. Coffee was poured and ignored. Tablets glowed with data that nobody wanted to read. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of what they were about to discuss. General sat at the head of the table. He was 61 years old with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and eyes that had seen things he would never discuss in polite company. He had led ground forces during the Mars insurrection when human colonists had briefly turned against Earth. He had buried friends on 3 different worlds. He understood war in ways that most of the people in this room could only imagine. Admiral Ben Carter sat to his right. Ben was 51 and had risen through the ranks faster than anyone in Terran Navy history. He had a reputation for being calm under pressure and absolutely ruthless when calm stopped working. His father had been a fisherman on the coast of Maine, and his mother had been a school teacher. They had raised him to believe that strength without compassion was just cruelty wearing a uniform. Secretary of Defense Heather sat across from them. She was a former Marine who had lost her left leg below the knee during a training accident and refused to let it slow her down. She walked with a slight limp that she ignored and spoke with a directness that made politicians uncomfortable. She had no patience for people who valued their careers more than their principles. Senator Laura Marsh represented the opposition. She was intelligent and cautious and genuinely believed that humanity's survival depended on avoiding unnecessary conflicts. She had built her career on diplomacy and careful calculation. She was not wrong about many things, but she was about to be wrong about the most important thing she had ever considered. President Cole arrived last and took his seat at the center of the table. He was tall with graying hair and kind eyes that concealed a mind sharper than most people realized. Before entering politics, he had been a history professor at a small university in Virginia. He had written 3 books about the wars of the 20th century and what they revealed about human nature. He understood that there were moments in history when caution became cowardice and inaction became complicity. General began by presenting the tactical situation. The Dominion had 300 warships in orbit around Prime. Their ground forces numbered in the millions. The military had been effectively destroyed in the first week of fighting. Conservative estimates suggested that the planet would be fully conquered within 72 hours. Admiral Carter brought up a display showing the current disposition of the Terran fleet. Humanity had 219 combat-ready vessels scattered across a dozen systems. Assembling them into a single strike force would take approximately 48 hours. It would also leave Earth and the colony worlds with minimal defense. Senator Marsh spoke first. She acknowledged the tragedy unfolding on Prime, but reminded the Council that they were not allies. They had opposed humanity at every turn. They They had voted against Terran membership in the Galactic Council twice. Intervening in their conflict would violate galactic law and potentially invite retaliation against human worlds. She argued that the responsible course was to offer humanitarian aid after the conflict ended, and to raise the matter formally with the Galactic Council. Secretary asked what humanitarian aid they could offer to a dead civilization. Senator Marsh replied that not every tragedy could be prevented, and that humanity had to consider its own survival first. Admiral Carter stood and walked to the display. He changed the image to show a map of the galactic sector. He pointed to the and then traced a line through the neighboring systems. He explained that the Dominion had been expanding steadily for 2 centuries. They consumed species one at a time, always choosing targets that were isolated and friendless. The would be next. Then the smaller species that clung to the edges of civilized space. And when all of them were gone, the Dominion would reach the borders of human territory. He asked the Council what they thought would happen then. Would the Galactic Council intervene to save humanity? Would the species who watched the die suddenly find their courage when Earth was burning? Senator Marsh argued that building alliances took time, and that rushing into war would only make enemies. Admiral Carter replied that they would not have time to build alliances if they stood by and watched every potential ally be destroyed. President Cole had been listening without comment. He stood slowly and walked to the window that looked out over the city. New Washington had been rebuilt after the Cascade event that had killed millions and reminded humanity how fragile civilization truly was. The scars were still visible if you knew where to look. He asked the Council a question. He asked them what kind of species they wanted humanity to be. Senator Marsh started to answer, but he raised his hand. He continued. He said that every species in the galaxy had faced this choice at some point in their history. They had all seen injustice and weighed the cost of opposing it against the safety of doing nothing. Most had chosen safety. Most had decided that their own survival mattered more than their principles. And look at what the galaxy had become. A collection of frightened species hiding behind treaties that nobody enforced, watching each other suffer and telling themselves that it was not their concern. He turned to face the Council. He said that humanity was young. They had only been in space for a few generations. They did not have the power or the technology or the experience of the older races, but they had something that most of those races had lost. They still remembered what it meant to stand for something. Senator Marsh asked if he was seriously suggesting that they risk the survival of their entire species for a people who had shown them nothing but contempt. President Cole smiled slightly. He said that they had been wrong about humanity, but being wrong was not a death sentence. It was an opportunity to prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. He looked at Admiral Carter. He said 2 words. Assemble the fleet. The room erupted in voices, but President Cole simply sat down and waited for silence. When it came, he explained that he would take full responsibility for this decision. If they failed, the history books would blame him and him alone. But he believed they would not fail because he had seen what humans could do when they decided that something mattered more than their own survival. Admiral Carter was already on his feet and heading for the door. He had 48 hours to gather every fighting ship humanity possessed and lead them into a battle against an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1. He had never felt more alive. Secretary caught up with him in the corridor. She asked if he really thought they could win. Ben Carter stopped and looked at her with eyes that held no doubt. He said that winning was not the point. The point was showing up. The point was proving that there was still at least one species in this galaxy that would answer when someone called for help. Everything else was just details. He walked away and began making calls. Across human space, captains and crews received orders that would change the course of galactic history. And on a small patrol vessel at the edge of known space, Admiral received confirmation that her faith had not been misplaced. Humanity was coming. Ambassador had stopped counting the days because counting implied that there would be more days to count. The underground bunker had become a tomb for the living. Survivors crowded into every corner, their blue faces hollow with hunger and fear. The emergency rations had run out yesterday. The water recyclers were failing. Above them, the Dominion ground troops were landing in waves, and there was nothing left to stop them. He sat alone in the communications room and stared at the blank screens. The distress calls had stopped going out because there was no one left to send them and no point in sending them anyway. The galaxy had heard their cries and the galaxy had done nothing. This was how civilizations ended, not with a great battle but with silence and abandonment. Overlord had broadcast terms of surrender that morning, complete submission to the Dominion, integration of all surviving into the labor caste. Children would be separated from parents and raised in Dominion education facilities. Adults would work until they died. The old and the sick would be processed immediately because they offered nothing of value. Had not responded, there was nothing to say. In orbit, the Dominion fleet maintained their positions with the casual confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. 300 warships formed a perfect sphere around the planet. Supply vessels moved between them carrying troops and equipment to the surface. The operation was proceeding exactly according to schedule. Overlord was already drafting his report to the Dominion High Council, describing another successful conquest. The first rupture appeared at the edge of the system at 1400 hours local time. The Dominion sensor operator on the command ship noted it without concern. Probably a council observer ship, he thought. The older races sometimes sent vessels to document these operations. They never interfered. They just watched and recorded and went home to file reports that nobody would ever read. Then another rupture appeared, and another, and another. The sensor operator felt the first stirring of confusion. This was more than an observer mission. He began counting the emerging vessels and felt confusion give way to something colder. By the time he reached 100, he was running to find his commander. Overlord was in his private quarters, reviewing the day's casualty reports, when the sensor operator burst through the door. The commander turned with cold fury at the interruption, but the expression on his subordinate's face stopped him mid-reprimand. 173 vessels, the operator said. Human configuration, military formation, weapons systems active. Moved quickly to the command bridge. He had heard of humans but never considered them a threat. They were primitives who had only achieved faster-than-light travel within living memory. Their ships were small and their technology was crude compared to Dominion standards. They had no allies and no stake in this conflict. He looked at the tactical display and saw the human fleet arranged in perfect formation. At the center was a single massive vessel, larger than anything humans were supposed to possess. It broadcast a signature that identified it as the USS Constellation, flagship of the Terran Second Fleet. Then the communication array activated, and a human face appeared on every screen in the Dominion fleet. Admiral Ben Carter looked tired. His uniform was wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much coffee. He sat in a command chair that was clearly designed for function rather than comfort. Behind him, human crew members worked at their stations with quiet efficiency. When he spoke, his voice was calm and clear, and carried the weight of absolute conviction. "This is Admiral Ben Carter of the United Terran Navy," he said. "The people are under our protection. You have 1 hour to withdraw from this system. If you remain, we will destroy you. There will be no further warnings." The transmission ended. Overlord stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Then he began to laugh. The sound echoed through the command bridge and his officers joined in, partly because they genuinely found the situation amusing, and partly because failing to laugh at their commander's jokes was unwise. The humans were outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Their ships were smaller and less powerful. Their species had no experience with large-scale fleet combat. This was not a threat. This was a gift. Ordered his fleet to attack. In the bunker beneath the surface, Ambassador heard the news from a young communications officer who had managed to get one of the sensors working again. The officer's hands were shaking as he described what he was seeing. Human ships. More human ships than anyone had thought existed. They had come from nowhere and they were demanding that the Dominion leave. Did not believe it at first. Humans had no reason to help the council had rejected them twice. Himself had spoken against them. He had called them children playing at civilization. He had suggested that they be supervised and controlled for their own good. And now those same humans had brought their entire fleet to die for a species that had offered them nothing but contempt. He made his way to the sensor room and watched the display. The Dominion fleet was moving to engage. The human fleet was not retreating. Both sides were accelerating toward each other, and within minutes they would collide in a storm of fire and death. A young child tugged at his sleeve. She was perhaps 6 years old with wide eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. She asked him what was happening. looked at the display, and then down at the child. "The humans came," he said quietly. He did not understand why, but he knew that it was true. Against all logic and self-interest, a species that had every reason to let them die had instead chosen to risk everything to save them. The child asked if the humans would win. Watched the fleets closing on each other. He did not know the answer. The odds were against the humans. The Dominion had never been defeated in open battle, but something in his chest that he had thought long dead began to stir. He told the child that he did not know if the humans would win, but he knew that they had chosen to fight, and sometimes that was enough. On the USS Constellation, Admiral Carter watched the tactical display with focused intensity. The Dominion fleet was doing exactly what he had expected. They were forming their traditional crescent formation, designed to envelope and crush enemy forces through superior numbers. It had worked for them 100 times before. But it was not going to work today. He opened a channel to his fleet commanders. 12 captains looked back at him from their respective bridges. They were men and women who had trained for this moment their entire lives without ever really believing it would come. Now it was here, and there was no more time for doubt. Carter gave them their final orders: break formation, independent action, strike and withdraw, make them chase you, make them think you are everywhere at once, and when you see an opening, take it without hesitation. The channel closed. The human fleet began to scatter into smaller groups. The Dominion tactical officers watched in confusion as their enemy abandoned all conventional formation and became something chaotic and unpredictable. Admiral Carter leaned back in his chair and waited. The first shots of the Battle of Prime were fired at 14:47 local time. The engagement would last for 11 hours and change the galaxy forever. But that was for later. In this moment, as the void filled with fire and the future hung in the balance, all that mattered was that humanity had answered the call. They had asked for backup. Humans had answered with a war fleet. The void between worlds became a sea of fire and death. Weapons that could crack continents lashed across the darkness. Ships that had taken years to build were torn apart in seconds. Men and women who had families waiting for them back home died in the cold silence of space without ever knowing if their sacrifice had meant anything. Captain Lisa Martinez commanded Strike Group Bravo from the heavy cruiser USS Tempest. She was 40 years old with dark hair cut short for practicality, and a tattoo on her left forearm that read "No Retreat" in her grandmother's handwriting. Her grandmother had been a soldier too, and had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. Her orders were simple: drive into the heart of the Dominion formation and destroy their command and communication ships. If she succeeded, the enemy fleet would lose coordination and become vulnerable. If she failed, her entire strike group would be destroyed, and the battle would become much harder to win. She did not hesitate. The Tempest and her escort ships accelerated directly toward the center of the Dominion fleet. Enemy vessels turned to intercept, but Lisa had trained her crews for exactly this kind of engagement. They used the debris fields created by destroyed ships as cover. They fired in coordinated bursts that overwhelmed enemy shields. They moved with a speed and precision that the Dominion had never encountered. Within the first 30 minutes, Strike Group Bravo had destroyed 7 enemy communication relays and 2 command vessels. The Dominion formation began to fragment as individual ships lost contact with their commanders and started making independent decisions. Some pressed the attack. Others held position waiting for orders that would never come. A few began to withdraw toward the edge of the system. Lisa watched her tactical display and saw the chaos spreading through the enemy fleet. She also saw that 3 of her escort ships had been destroyed and 2 more were badly damaged. The Tempest herself had taken multiple hits, and her engineering crew was fighting to keep the reactor stable. She opened a channel to Admiral Carter and reported her status. Ben Carter's voice came back steady and calm. He told her that she had done exactly what he needed. Now he wanted her to withdraw and regroup with the reserve force. Lisa looked at her display again. The path between her position and the reserve force was blocked by a cluster of Dominion destroyers. Fighting through them would cost her more ships, but there was another option. She could push deeper into the enemy formation and continue the attack. Her ships were damaged but still fighting. If she kept pressing, she might be able to reach the Dominion flagship itself. She told the Admiral her plan. There was a long pause. Then Ben Carter told her that the decision was hers. He trusted her judgment. Lisa Martinez looked at the faces of her bridge crew. They were scared and tired, and some of them were wounded. But they were also looking at her with absolute faith. They would follow her into the heart of a sun if she asked them to. She gave the order to advance. On the other side of the battle, Commander Danny Park was leading a squadron of fast attack ships in a flanking maneuver that was driving the Dominion tactical officers mad. Danny was 35 years old and had grown up racing speeders through the canyons of Mars. He understood momentum and timing in a way that could not be taught in any academy. His ships were small and lightly armed but incredibly fast. He used that speed to appear where the enemy did not expect him, strike hard and disappear before they could respond. The Dominion doctrine called for enemies to meet force with force. They had no protocols for an opponent who refused to stand and fight. Danny's squadron destroyed 12 enemy vessels in the first 2 hours of the battle. They did not lose a single ship because they were never in one place long enough to be targeted effectively. The Dominion commanders began diverting more and more resources to chase him, which was exactly what Admiral Carter wanted. Every ship chasing Danny was a ship not attacking the main fleet. At the center of the engagement, the USS Constellation was taking fire from multiple directions. Admiral Carter had positioned his flagship where it would draw the most attention, and the Dominion had obliged. They saw the large vessel and assumed that destroying it would break human morale. They did not understand humans. The Constellation had been designed by engineers who knew that their creation would face exactly this situation. Every system had backups. Every hull section could be isolated if breached. The ship could lose half its mass and still keep fighting. When the main batteries opened fire, each shot was precisely calibrated to exploit weaknesses in Dominion shield harmonics. Human intelligence officers had spent years analyzing captured Dominion technology and developing countermeasures. Ships that had withstood hours of conventional bombardment fell apart in minutes under the Constellation's focused assault. Overlord watched his fleet crumbling and felt something he had never experienced before: fear. The humans were not fighting like any species he had ever encountered. They were not trying to match his strength. They were finding his weaknesses and attacking them with surgical precision. He made a decision born of desperation. He ordered his command ship and its escort to charge directly at the Constellation. If he could destroy the human admiral, perhaps the rest of their fleet would lose heart and retreat. It was a gamble, but he was running out of options. 6 human destroyers moved to block his path. Commander was in charge of the lead destroyer, the USS Defiant. She was 38 years old with red hair and freckles that made her look younger than she was. Her crew called her Iron because she never seemed to bend no matter how hard the pressure got. She saw the Dominion command ship approaching and understood immediately what was happening. The Overlord was trying to cut the head off the snake. If he reached the Constellation, the battle might still be lost. Her destroyers were outmatched. The Dominion command ship was a massive vessel with weapons that could tear her entire squadron apart in minutes. The smart thing to do would be to withdraw and let larger ships handle the threat. Had never been interested in doing the smart thing. She opened a channel to her crews. She told them that the enemy wanted their admiral. She told them that the only way to reach Admiral Carter was through the USS Defiant and her sisters. She asked them if they were willing to stand. Every ship confirmed. The 6 destroyers formed a wall between the charging Dominion command ship and the Constellation. They opened fire with everything they had. The enemy returned fire with weapons that turned armor to vapor and crews to ash. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. 4 of the 6 destroyers were destroyed or crippled. Hundreds of sailors died. Commander's bridge took a direct hit that killed half her crew and left her trapped under a collapsed support beam with a broken spine and burns covering 30% of her body. But they held the line. Reinforcements arrived just as the last destroyer was about to fall. Fresh ships from the reserve force poured fire into the Dominion command ship until its shields collapsed and its hull began to break apart. Overlord tried to escape in a transport, but a missile from the Tempest caught him before he could reach safe distance. The Dominion fleet saw their commander die and their formation collapse completely. Ships began fleeing toward the edge of the system. Some tried to surrender, but the chaos of battle made communication difficult. By the time the sun set on Prime, 112 Dominion vessels had been destroyed. 63 more had surrendered. The rest were gone. Humanity had won. The cost was terrible. 41 human ships had been destroyed. Over 9,000 sailors would never go home. The constellation was so badly damaged that it would take a year to repair. But they were free, and the Dominion had learned a lesson that would echo across the galaxy. There was a new species in the stars, and they did not leave their friends behind. Commander was pulled from the wreckage of her bridge by rescue teams who had to cut through 3 meters of twisted metal to reach her. She was conscious when they found her, and her first words were to ask about her crew. They told her that the Defiant had held the line. They told her that Admiral Carter was alive. They told her that the battle was won. She smiled through the pain and closed her eyes. She had done her duty. Everything else was just details. The smoke was still rising from the ruins of the capital when the first human shuttles descended through the atmosphere. Ambassador stood in what had once been the central plaza and watched them come. His robes were torn and stained with the evidence of 17 days of hell. His hands would not stop shaking, but he was alive. His people were alive, and that was more than he had dared to hope. The survivors emerged from their shelters and bunkers and stared at the sky with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Children who had spent weeks hiding in darkness pointed at the strange vessels and asked their parents what they were. Parents who had prepared themselves to die looked at each other and wept. Admiral Ben Carter was on the first shuttle to touch down. He walked down the ramp slowly, taking in the destruction around him. His uniform was rumpled, and there were circles under his eyes that spoke of days without sleep. He looked like a man who had carried a heavy weight for a very long time and was only now allowing himself to feel the strain. Walked toward him through the rubble. He had been a diplomat for over a century. He had negotiated with species that viewed conversation as a form of combat. He had never once been at a loss for words. Now he could not think of a single thing to say. Admiral Carter stopped in front of him and extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting, took it, and felt the warmth of human skin against his own cool fingers. The Admiral spoke first. He said he apologized for the delay. Stared at him, he asked why. He asked why the humans had come, that had never helped them. They had voted against human interests at every opportunity. They had called humans children and primitives and suggested that they be controlled for their own good. They had offered nothing but contempt. Admiral Carter looked at the ruined buildings and the survivors emerging from the shadows. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that they had asked for help, and that was enough. Did not understand. In his experience, species only risked themselves for clear benefit. Alliances were built on mutual interest. Aid was given in exchange for something of value. Nobody sacrificed their own children for strangers who had treated them poorly. But the humans had done exactly that. 9,000 of them had died for a people who had given them nothing. 41 ships that could have defended human worlds had been destroyed, saving lives. And the Admiral standing before him spoke as if this was the most natural thing in the universe. Human medics were already moving through the plaza, treating wounded without asking for payment or permission. Human engineers were examining damaged infrastructure and discussing repair options. Human soldiers were distributing food and water from their own supplies. Nobody was keeping track. Nobody was calculating the debt. Asked Admiral Carter what the humans wanted in return. The Admiral smiled slightly. He said he wanted them to remember this day, not the destruction or the death, but the fact that someone had come when they called. He wanted them to remember that the galaxy did not have to be a place where species watched each other suffer and did nothing. He wanted them to remember that courage was contagious. Then he excused himself because there was a lot of work to do. The news of the Battle of Prime spread across the galaxy within days. Species that had dismissed humanity as primitives watched the tactical recordings and struggled to process what they were seeing. The Dominion had been considered invincible. Their fleet had crushed every opponent they had ever faced, and a young species that had barely mastered faster-than-light travel had defeated them against overwhelming odds. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Representatives from 100 different species filled the Great Chamber and argued about what this meant. Some called for sanctions against humanity for violating the principle of non-interference. Others demanded to know why the Council had done nothing while they were dying. Ambassador addressed the assembly. He described what he had witnessed: the arrival of the human fleet, the courage of their crews, the compassion of their medics, the fact that they had asked for nothing in return. He said that the Council had failed them. They had sent messages of sympathy and done nothing else. They had watched children being loaded onto harvest ships and debated procedure. They had proven that their grand alliances and treaties meant nothing when tested. But the humans had come. They had risked everything for a species that had treated them with contempt, and in doing so, they had shown the galaxy what it had forgotten. Strength was not about ships or weapons or technology. Strength was about standing up for those who could not stand for themselves. When the vote was called on humanity's application for full council membership, the result was unanimous. Every species that had once opposed them now raised their voices in favor, not because they feared human military power, but because they finally understood what kind of species they were dealing with. Back on Earth, the USS Constellation limped into orbital dock 3 weeks after the battle. Crowds gathered in New Washington to welcome the fleet home. President Cole stood on the steps of the Capitol and watched the shuttles descend. Beside him, Senator Laura Marsh was quiet. A reporter asked her if she regretted opposing the intervention. She took a long time to answer. She said that she had spent her entire career believing that caution was the same as wisdom. She had thought that protecting your own was more important than protecting others. She had been afraid. She said she was not afraid anymore. The ceremony to honor the fallen took place in the memorial garden that had been built after the Cascade event. 9,000 names were read aloud. Each one was followed by a moment of silence. It took 7 hours. Admiral Carter stood at attention the entire time. When it was over, he walked alone through the garden and stopped at a particular section where fresh plaques had been installed. He found the name he was looking for. Commander. She had survived her injuries but would never walk again. She had told him that she considered it a fair trade. Lieutenant Commander Jake found him there. The young officer had served aboard the Constellation throughout the battle and had proven himself beyond any doubt. He would receive a promotion and a command of his own in the coming months. He asked the admiral if he thought they had done the right thing. Carter reached into his pocket and a small wooden figure. It was a carved child, given to him by a survivor on Prime. The artist had spent hours on it despite having lost everything. It was a gift of pure gratitude. He told Jake that every person they had lost had chosen to be there. They had known the risks and the odds. They had gone anyway because somewhere far away, children were dying and someone had to do something. That was what it meant to be human, not their technology or their ships, not their weapons or their tactics, but the stubborn belief that every life mattered, even lives that had shown them nothing but contempt. He looked up at the stars. He said that humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest or the most advanced, but they might just be the ones who remembered why any of it mattered. Across the galaxy, in council chambers and command centers and humble homes on 1,000 different worlds, the story of Prime was told and retold. Parents shared it with their children. Teachers included it in their lessons. Military academies studied the tactics. Philosophers debated the ethics. And everyone who heard the story learned the same lesson. When you are in your darkest hour, when all hope seems lost, when even your allies have abandoned you, there is one species you can call. They might be young. They might be considered primitive by galactic standards. They might be emotional and stubborn and impossible to predict. But they will come. No matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter how badly you have treated them in the past. They will come. Because that is who they are. That is who they have always been. And that is who they will always be. The stars are vast and cold and indifferent. The universe does not care about justice or mercy or the fate of civilizations. Empires rise and fall, and the void swallows them without a trace. But somewhere in that endless darkness, there is a small blue planet that refuses to accept that this is how things have to be. And the people of that planet will keep reaching out their hands to strangers in need. Not because it is easy, not because it is safe, but because it is right. And in the end, that is the only thing that matters.